that Mr. Chetan?
Hi, Daniel.
Chetan, it's wonderful to see you again. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm frantically figuring out what I'm going to say for the Nietzsche conference. Like, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. Yeah, I had to travel yesterday. I have a wedding on Friday and Saturday, so I'm Sunday. And I'm going, oh, darn it. That's right. So, yeah, I'm really interested. The title of it is on the Overmen and the children of Nietzsche and intrinsic motivation and coming out of Plato's cave. And kind of the idea of this interesting question of, in the Republic, someone drags you out of the cave, right? Okay, well, what if no one comes to drag you out? Or what if it's a parable where a prisoner on their own leaves? And it's interesting, we almost kind of remember the parable as someone leaving on their own. But that's not actually how the story goes. So that kind of has a gaping question on like a kind of a giant question of, well, how did the first prisoner leave the cave? Or how do we leave the cave if nobody drags us? And there's a way in which I see Nietzsche's philosophy situated on that question. Where in some respects, like, I also think it's really important to see Overmen and man. In Beyond Good and Evil, he says something along the lines of, Overmen and man are kind of can be in the same soul. Like if you go through history, you see them divided, but actually, and sometimes they come together. And it's almost like after the death of God, that it's more so that everyone has kind of the man and Overmen, the noble morality and the master morality and the servant morality. Which again, it's really important. Those are entirely different ethical sets. It's not merely master versus servant, but master thinks in terms of noble and contemptible, whereas slave thinks in terms of good and evil. And the reason Nietzsche has a problem with the slave mentality, as he calls it, is because good is simply the absence of evil. It's good not to lie. It's good not to steal. Well, what's kind of the positive though, right? That's what he's kind of concerned. He's like, well, what is good? Not just simply the lack of evil. Well, that would require the master ethic where you're able to say something is noble, something is good, right? You have the ability on, but that requires a certain existential competence, that requires a certain standard of excellence, and to be able to say that something is noble. And so it's almost like, and therefore, when we think about the overcoming man, it's kind of the ability to overcome, say, the slave morality into a master morality, but everyone within them has that kind of dialectical tension that's at operation. And I like thinking of it that way because also if an overarching question of Cadell's work, which I think is really important, is the combination between Hegel and Nietzsche. The more we can think of Nietzsche as someone who's positing a kind of dialectical tension within human beings, a realization where creation and realization for Nietzsche are very close. To me, those start putting Hegel and Nietzsche together. And then all of that has to be connected to the question of intrinsic motivation. How does one gain the ability? Where does the ability come from to be able to say that is noble and to truly believe it? So those are kind of some of the thoughts that are going through my head at this point.
Really interesting. So, the way I think one of the things that I can immediately think about, I don't know whether it makes sense or not, but when we think about the overman, what is interesting about the overman is that it is eternally stuck in questions of repetition. In some senses, because what does it mean to be an overman? Either you mean overman to be something different from man. That's a different story, but that is not what Nietzsche is saying. Nietzsche is saying that overman has to emerge from within man itself. Then the potentiality for that overman actually exists in the repetition of man itself. As the set man repeats, there's something within that repetition of the set of man that a possibility of overman emerges. And the question becomes, what is the nature of that possibility within that repetition in some senses? And I think the question of motivation and the question of overman there coincide also, because that is where you would find that is where you would find this possibility of existing in some motivation, something different from which will only repeat the set man in some sense. Otherwise, why should we even have the motivation to do something else? Isn't it? Why should we even have that kind of a motivation? In the absence of that potentiality being there, and then we need to think through that question: that what is it about that repetition of the set man that gives us that way to think about it. And of course, in Nietzsche, what is interesting is that Nietzsche's argument would be that that this potentiality doesn't exist within the man itself. There's nothing of that nature. For Nietzsche, this potentiality would exist in repetition itself. Because for Nietzsche, as I say, for Aristotle, the subject of desire and subject of knowledge are within one another. But Nietzsche says that these are different subjective positions, and you have to bring them in contact with one another. There is no necessity that subject of knowledge and subject of desire has to coincide. For Nietzsche, that necessity doesn't exist in the way it would exist for Aristotle in that sense. So for Nietzsche, one can suppose that potentiality doesn't lie within the man, in the sense that man will necessarily become overman through some immediate processes. There is a certain work required in Nietzschean world. Nietzsche is not presupposing this. For him, the future is still very open in that sense. Overman is a symbol for that complete openness rather than this complete closeness, that we will become something else and we are moving in that direction and so on and so forth. That teleological thinking is not there, I think. So then how do we, place that motivation in that repetition then?
Absolutely. There was a bunch of things you said that was outstanding. So a few things come to mind. One, there's a long tradition that I think we forget, where the question of the good and motivation are tied together. So going back to, say, St. Augustine, for example, if you do it, you think it is good by definition. If you murder someone, even if it is evil, you must think it's good, otherwise you would not do it. And likewise, if you think something is good, then it must necessarily compel motivation toward it. And actually, I think this notion, this kind of classical notion of the link between ethics and motivation, can actually help bring out why Nietzsche is critical of slave morality or ethics of good and evil. Because if good is merely the opposite of evil, that doesn't necessarily motivate action. All it really does is kind of frame what you shouldn't do. Like, if I know that it's good not to steal, what action am I motivated to do? I'm motivated not to steal, but that's like a negative action. It's not a positive action, right? But if I am of the noble morality and I say this is noble, let's say I say fighting is noble, or I say art is noble, or I say overcoming pain is noble. Well, that is a different kind of ethics, of which compels you ought to do it, right? But what's important is this ought is derived from one's own ability to identify a thing as noble. And the ought, therefore, is self-created. But very important, he says in book 1 of Zarathustra, there's this point where he talks about people picking goods and evil and then hanging it around their neck like a law. Like, this is really important. Like, the key is to be able to say, I think this is noble, and then not treat it arbitrarily. You say, this is noble, and I'm going to thus impose upon myself a certain kind of law by my own choosing that is going to compel action and honoring of that thing. So what's really important is Nietzsche does not, when he does not view the selection of something as noble as arbitrary, because the very act of saying something is noble then compels you. Right? It compels you, it demands something of you. And so for me, it's really helpful when Nietzsche says beyond good and evil. In Beyond Good and Evil, he has a few lines. He says one line at some point where he says, love is always beyond good and evil, in one of his aphorisms, which is actually really important, because what you love also motivates you, right? If you love it, you find it noble, you find it good, you find it true, and you find it beautiful. So when he talks about beyond good and evil, he's talking about beyond an ethical system of good and evil, where good is defined as the absence of evil, into an ethical system that's more classical, of the ability to identify something as noble, right? And to say for yourself that it is noble, of which then necessarily in that very selection intrinsically motivates you to do it and to see it as good. So I think the linking of Nietzsche's ethics with the question of motivation is utterly paramount. And motivation is lurking in the background of Nietzsche the entire time. He talks about the self-turning wheel. Obviously, that's all there. But to really kind of frame it in those terms, I think is really, really, really important. And then the other thing I was going to say, and then I'll give it back to you, is the phrase overmen. It kind of reminds me, like, if I were to say Sufi, Christian, Hindu, like, so for example, I'll just use Christian as an example. When I say someone is a Christian, it has a few functions. One, there is the identification of a kind of towardness, but it also can be a kind of ideal, right? So you could be a Christian even if you're not a perfect Christian. And it also means a certain expectation of the future as well, right? It has these different levels going on. We wouldn't say that a Sufi is ethnically or genetically different from another human being, but they have a certain orientation toward the world that simultaneously creates an identification and an ideal and an open notion of the future, because you don't know the exact ways that future will manifest, even if you have notions of what it should be like. Like you say, in Nietzsche, the future is very open, but he would hope that the future would be a place of nobility, the ability to identify nobility and intrinsic motivation. So I think it's helpful for me when I think of the Overman as having the kind of multiple functions as some sort of titles like that. Like if I say I am an engineer, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a perfect engineer, but it might mean I'm trying to be a perfect engineer. And it might mean that my future entails the designing of buildings according to engineer, right? But I wouldn't say that, oh, I'm an engineer, therefore I'm genetically, nationalistically, racially, whatever, distinct from the artist, right? We wouldn't think that way. It has a certain action and a certain compelling to it. So it helps me to think of Oberman that way. And Javier, we're doing, I guess this is the pre-conference for Nietzsche. We're talking about Nietzsche with the pre-conference or whatever, the Nietzsche pre-conference. So Javier, good to see you. So those are some thoughts that came to mind.
No, definitely. I remember, I think in the second section, maybe end of second section, if I remember correctly, he writes these lines that, that I don't want somebody for whom there's a generalized idea of good and evil. I don't remember the exact line, but what he means in the end, and this is the line he uses, I think, that I want somebody who's saying this is my good and this is my evil. Who can particularize it for that person, who can actually will it in that sense. And if you look at it, Hegel actually, this question comes up brilliantly. He doesn't refer to it directly, but if you read the first sections of Hegel before self-consciousness, it ends upon what you call the inverted world or the topsy-turvy world. And inverted world is actually that problem that Nietzsche is struggling with. The problem is that at some point when you're trying to look at something only from this opposition of subject and object, consciousness and the other in that sense, the world itself becomes inverted for you. Good becomes evil, evil becomes good. At some point, this inversion is going to take place for you. And then I think what's the way forward from, and in Nietzsche also the problem emerges immediately in that sense that for Nietzsche simply this distinct idea of good and evil doesn't work.
Right.
It becomes, as we can say, inverted, it becomes mixed up, it becomes botched up. And for Nietzsche, only clarity can come in when you can actually find this question of your will into it. And Hegel's self-consciousness section is exactly that, this splitting of the consciousness into the mediating middle and so on and so forth. But Nietzsche, that question of self-consciousness becomes a question of will. And I think that is where you can see your motivation also. That will is a question of motivation. Will is not simply a question of something happening automatically. For him, this problem of willing is important, and which is why for him the question is not to get this very neat idea that I am good or evil, but to be particular about it, but to be able to understand what is your good and evil.
Right.
In that sense, and that is why the distinction good and bad is more accurate for him than good and evil, and so on and so forth. I think that's where I can at least think of the Nietzsche in some senses with Hegel in this trajectory. Trying to say that in Nietzsche, this question of will becomes extremely important, and will is not simply a question of that bad way of putting it. It's not simply a question of having right intentions. I want to do good. You won't get will just by doing that. Willing involves something else in that trajectory, and we need to think about that. Is why it becomes a question of motivation.
Right.
Oh,
it's not simply a question of saying because I am thinking my intentions are right in some senses and I want to do good, so I can't do evil. In fact, one of the classical, I think, lines of one of this author was that the very idea of evil is that even when you have best intentions to do something,
yes,
and you go and do it, you will realize that at some point this inversion takes place, that as Hegel talks about it. At some point the good will become evil.
Right.
And unless you are aware of your own will in that sense, you will not be able to realize at what point this switch has taken place. And almost all ideas go through that switch, which is why I think, Hegel's last section is extremely interesting and important, which we normally get ignored. I was looking at Zizek's Surplus Enjoyment, and he actually started his book with this question of topsy-turvy world, the inverted world of Hegel, actually. So even Zizek's thinking actually somewhere coming down to that. That's a very important section for our times, at least, the inverted world section, in some sense.
It does make me think, though, and this is something that I'm trying to bring up in my own presentation. This idea of thinking about tension relativity, basically, where because Nietzsche is very much into the metaphors of dancing, right? What we need to do when we talk about motivation is that the motivation is there, but it's in the rhythm of the tension. So it's about basically moving into the tension of where that we sort of like, I guess, make true decisions and discover like our true particular evil and goodness. So and I've been speculating the idea that actually the eternal recurrence is actually that very rhythm. But just like a game of like double Dutch, for example, you have to find your opening when you decide to go in. The rhythm is always constant, it's going, it's repeating. However, you have to have the courage, right? We're sort of using Nietzsche's language to sort of step in, and then that limited container of repetition is actually what, ironically enough, provokes creativity within the container. And I think that's what Nietzsche's like whole problem is with like transcending the container, is that we never actually tested out what we can do within the container. We keep trying to escape it. So the idea of like being limited actually provokes creativity, and it's such a tension within itself. And I keep thinking of like, like baseball players or like basketball players when they like do something crazy within the confines of the rules itself. They're like breaking history and like reaching new limits. The same thing with like freestyle rapping. You're given like a beat, and then somehow a guy's able to like make it his own somehow. And that's a lot of the thinking that I've been speculating on, like more of like the pragmatic approach to a methodology of leadership, which I'm calling dancing kenosis, which is like where, because at least kenosis is obviously a very complex topic in Christian theology because it's always advancing. But at least so far, a very mundane example would be like Christians sort of see kenosis as like, being humble, emptying yourself, so on. But I think with Nietzsche, it gets a little bit more complex in the sense of you don't want to empty yourself all the time. You want to empty yourself at the right moments. And then there's also moments where you want to refrain from emptying and then empty. So there is like this dance, you could say, that's going on that you have to decide. And I think this is why I like tension relativity, because it's going to sort of indicate to you when you should empty. And so you're just sort of like dancing around this whole thing. But yeah, that's kind of like where I've been going with like this notion of like tension relativity and dancing for like motivation.
Javier, I don't know it will help you or not, but just what you said reminded me of something actually. In Nietzsche, I think there's a paragraph somewhere in between, I think second, third section or something, where he's saying that I don't want a God which cannot dance.
Yeah.
If you remember, there was a line like that. And I remember attending a talk by one of those scholars he was a vice chancellor of Ashoka University back then, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, and he was talking about this risk that we have to take when we act in the world. We always risk, this issue of failing in that sense. And the only point in the human experience where that risk is overcome is in dance.
Yes.
It's only in dance, you have to overcome that risk in some senses, which is why dance is a very interesting human activity to think about within that realm. And I think for Nietzsche, dancing becomes an extremely interesting. What does Nietzsche mean by dance in that sense? It's an extremely interesting question to think about.
No, and I agree. I think like dancing, it's funny because I was watching some videos on like freestyle dancing, and the coach for this, he literally says this. He goes, "There is no such thing as bad or good in this arena, but it does take practice to sort of get into like your own, I guess, into like your own style of something. So there is some type of criteria, but it's not just like good and bad. So which is so fascinating when Nietzsche talks about like this idea of like good and evil.
I would say that you cannot have a premeditated idea of a good dance and a bad dance. There cannot be any premeditated guarantees of this is a good dance and that's a bad dance in that sense. So there's something interesting over how Nietzsche is using dance and its relationship to action and motivation in that sense.
No, so now it all makes sense. I always thought that the Asian kid on the DDR machine and Putt Putt was the Overman, and now I know for a fact that it was. Because every time I would get on that DDR machine and he beat the crap out of me, I was like, yeah, he's beyond good and evil. So it all makes sense now. He's on some sort of transcendent being. Tyler, good to see you, sir. It's a pleasure. Yeah, by the way, DDR, actually, that is a great game. That will get you into the Nietzschean mindset. So, there's a few things that come to mind. One, I really like this idea of tension relativity, Mr. Rivera. I think that's very good. It makes me think, I always think it's very important that the opposite of faith is fear, actually not doubt. Doubt is simply a conditioning of fear. Of faith, where fear is when you don't do something. So the opposite of faith is actually fear. And it's very important that actually very often, say, if I'm using the gospel as a reference, it's fear that's a problem, right? That's where like someone doesn't do what they're supposed to do or they're afraid. And so really as a kind of good heuristic of what one needs to do in order to say spiritually develop is to face their fears. Like the one who fears is not made perfect, and love is a phrase in 1 John or different things like that. Now that has to be complexified because there seems to be a difference between an anxiety kind of fear and then a fear that's just wisdom. So for example, you should be afraid to drive a car 150 miles per hour down the road, right? That's just stupid, right? But then there's something about the fear of what if I go walking in the woods and get eaten by a bear, right? It's like you don't really have reason to think there's a bear there. You're just kind of afraid, and then you're like contained by anxiety, right? Now, of course, there's a gray zone here because there are bears in the woods, right? And there are bears that can eat you. So there's a gray zone, but this is why the particularity and awareness are such a big deal. And I don't think it's by chance that in Nietzsche, you're going to have such an emphasis on this kind of awareness and particularity, because if indeed the capacity to identify what is noble, what is good, what is beautiful and true is in the particular, and there's a particular tension relativity, then awareness is a huge deal. The ability to see clearly is a really big deal. And that gets into a kind of consciousness. I think this is why you do have some psychoanalytical thought that's going on in Nietzsche, because if you're confused in your thoughts, or if you're anxious, or you're controlled by, say, a master morality or different things like that, the chances of you being able to discern well in particular go down, right? And I think it's almost like when you make that example of the freestyle dancer. So Tyler, there's a Nietzsche conference coming up. We all have papers in it. So this is our pre-seminar on Nietzsche that we're talking about, and we're talking about dance and freestyle dance. And I brought up bears, so, good stuff. But anyway, it's almost like when you say there's no right or wrong in the freestyle dance, and yet there's still a technique. It's as if it's the entire flow of the music, right? Like it's the entire flow that can only be judged from the particular style of that dancer in the whole picture that they bring together, right? On that notion that it doesn't make sense to say right or wrong, it's kind of like if I were to sit down and play really beautiful piano music that is of my own making in the middle of Beethoven's ninth, it would be wrong, even though it was good, right? It would be beautiful. There's no mistakes in it, but it's not the correct context for playing that music at that time, right? So there's a contextual element that's going on that has to be judged along with it. And it's only from the sense of the whole and taking in the certain emotional disposition of the dancer. And if they're in line with their style, maybe they're in bad faith. Maybe they're using a style that their partner, like someone else uses, but they're doing because they think that's what they ought to do. So there's a kind of bad faith there. So technically it's good, but it's actually bad because it's not their style or in their flow or whatever. All of that, though, to discern requires a radical awareness, a radical ability to identify particularity in the concert of all the variables that that particularity is located in. And I think we see in Nietzsche a kind of emphasis on that. And his concern, if I were to speak generally, and then I'll give it to Mr. Javier, seems to be when we only think in categories of good and evil. And I should note this, I would actually say it when he's like the noble, in the noble mentality, you can also have a good and evil, but the issue is that in just a good and evil mentality, you don't necessarily also get the noble mentality. It's like a first thing, you can get both in one, but you don't necessarily get both in the other, right? And then if in the slave mentality, you only have good as defined as the opposite of evil, well, then you don't have any direction on what is the good. It's just kind of an opening, and you don't necessarily have the spiritual resources to discern for yourself what you should do as noble. But if you're pursuing the noble and you have that intrinsic motivation, you're probably not stealing too. You're probably not, say, burning stuff down like an arsonist. See how you get the good in that as well as the nobility. You get both that are included. So I think that's very important to note. Beyond good and evil is to say beyond autonomous good and evil per se, only thinking in terms. And I would also say that that good and evil ethic, that tends to be like a social ethic. It's like a societal ethic that says you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't burn buildings down because society will not function. And it's almost like you have an overfitting when you try to use a social ethic as an individual ethic. You know, it's not going to get there. And I think we actually see evidence of this with how many people later in life who are quote unquote good people, they went to college, they did a good job, and they don't know what to do with their life, right? Like everyone needs like life coaching and like help. Like they're good people, but you see in like midlife crises, you see in people not knowing to do with themselves, how there is an additional driver of action that needs to be included. And that to me is what Nietzsche is pointing at. It's like, okay, these people, they're good according to the social order. They've gone to college, they haven't stolen, they ain't done anything bad, and yet they're having a midlife crisis. They're having an inability to know what they want to do. And that is where Nietzsche's like, that's where you need the ability to discern for yourself what you think is noble, what you think is good, what you're going to go after, not because it's pure relativist, but because once you move to that individual level, once you've socially fitted, you still have the task of determining what you're going to do. And in that way, I think we can see the things fit together. And then the heuristics would be like tension relativity, facing your fear, the ability to stand up for what you believe is noble and to go through with it, even if you don't get social support. I think we can see the things start to work together, but I'll give it to Javier.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I like about Nietzsche, right? Like it almost like you can't give a universalist notion of social ethics. And I think I don't know where I argued this before, but basically I said like any like conception of social ethics already like fails, and because basically the moment two individuals meet, you're already engaging in some type of social ethics. Like it's already happening. And I think Nietzsche is trying to indicate that like it's already happening. The moment you sort of give a framework or some like kind of like rules for like, okay, this is what defines social ethics, that's not going to be social ethics anymore. But it's more like, actually, if you can teach an individual how to dance, then the social ethics is already happening. The dancing is already occurring. So if two individuals know how to dance, they know how to move with tension, then the social ethics is not something that needs to be dictated. It's already happening. It's already occurring. It's a part of the flow, the vital force itself. Which again, this is what I really like about Nietzsche. So this awareness that you're talking about, this is what has been causing me a lot of problems in my presentation, actually, because now that I have taken the notion of dancing kenosis, I have been considering what is the problem of timing. How does one discern when one should go into that tension and when one shouldn't? Because like you said, right? I think a very practical example is like, what's that kind of acting where you you make it up on the spot. What's that name?
Improvisation.
Yes,
Method acting,
improvisation, right? Improv, it can be good or bad, but it's all about reading like the situation, right? So there's a lot of context and a lot of opening that you have to read in order to jump in and be like, do something that still doesn't break the organization of the whole, but still becomes something innovative and cool that still maintains the whole. Like it's very complex, like when you really think about what Nietzsche is trying to ask for here, because there is this sense of like, if you do it too soon, you break it. If you do it too late, you also break it. You know, it just sounds off. And I think that's what we get the notion of God is dead. God is dead is, it's already, the music has stopped. There's another song playing, basically. So we're not keeping up. And I think somebody gave an earlier example to me in Cadell's office thing. It was James Wisdom. He said, you know, dancing is not something that we have to think about, right? We don't go left foot, right foot. All right, then I'm gonna move my left foot, then move my right foot, right? It's something that, you know, you just start engaging with, and then you start doing it. So it's weird, right? And a lot of comedians have talked about how, you know, it's just something that you do, and through the process of doing it, you start getting the idea of like how to move, how to have rhythm and everything. So, but to go back to some of Nietzsche's limitations, the one thing that I was able to find that can give a possible indicator of self-realization of maybe you did this too late was the idea of resentment or revenge. The moment you start culminating in ideas of resentment or revenge, basically you have already moved, you missed your timing, but you can still move. You can still choose to move. So this is the building of self-realization, to kind of help give some practicalness to like learning the rhythm. And by learning the rhythm, you understand that you failed to achieve that rhythmic quality when you start having those sensations of revenge and resentment. And so that means you should have moved on, but you didn't. And so those are good indicators that Nietzsche gives. And that's the only one that I have that sort of gives any indication of like timing.
I think that's very well put. And then I'll pass it on whoever likes to speak, because again, in the novel To Turn the World that we wrote, the great tension is between fear and wisdom. Like, when are you, say, being afraid to do something, and when are you, say, wise not to do something? And so likewise, there seems to be this timing issue where, you know, maybe at some time it's really good to play that piano song, but timing it in the middle of Beethoven's Ninth may not be a good idea, right? So there's this timing problem that's going on, and I think that's a great way to put it. And Mr. Luber, good to see you. I'll pass it on, Mr. Tyler. It's always good to see you, my friend. I hope you're doing well, and I really like the artistic metaphor that's being brought in. Tyler, good to see you, my friend.
You too. This reminds me, timing. This reminds me of a joke. Ask me what the secret of comedy is. Ask me what the secret of comedy is.
Tyler, what's the secret of comedy?
Timing.
Wow, that worked. I knew it was a joke, and it still worked. Wow, timing, huh?
Yeah, it's such an important aspect. Well, I mean, truthfully, because motion in space is measured by time, it's an aspect of everything. So it's literally tied together with reality. We can't really conceive of it outside of that. So, yeah, it's fascinating to me how genres change, like what causes them to change, how niches are constructed and how those are adjusted over time. The way that things are evaluated when they're in complex spaces, when you have, you know, when it's holographic, when you have multiple nodes that are representing the whole, if you try to adjust it, what you find is interesting is like, even though they're all perceiving the whole, each node has its own preferential aspect of the whole that they attach to. They don't attach to the whole thing, right? And they may not even see other aspects of it. So to make that concrete, like as a singular entity being, me, Tyler, There's things I prefer about myself, like that I see about myself and that I like about myself. And there are other aspects of this whole complex self that I don't see, that I prefer not to see, that I willfully do not interface with. So that shifting of the identity of the whole, right, that which I consider to be contained within the self, expressed outwards in the social, this is why it becomes such a magnified problem, I think. It's that same, well, how do you gather one together into an identity? Right? How do you unify these parts? Especially when you have disparate interests within. Okay. Are they synergistic or internecine? Is that a word? So there's something really curious about being able to watch this play out in the culture wars, right, in real time, like on the stage of life. Okay.
It makes me think, so last week, Mr. Luber is here. Mr. Luber and I have been having wonderful exchanges on this question of the story of meaning versus the meaning crisis, and the sort of idea that right now you're at a moment of a certain climax and choice and all those different things, which was a lot of fun. And we had a lot of talk on this issue of how meaning is not a primary thing, but it's a secondary thing. Like, you know, you get meaning from, say, facing your fears, but you don't go say, I'm going to find meaning and find that primarily. Meaning comes out of a certain act as a kind of byproduct, right? So that was kind of a question that sort of arose. However, at the same time, you know, something I forgot to bring up last week that's interesting, there's also a sociological meaning of the phrase, the meaning crisis, which gets into thinkers like Peter Berger, Philip Reeve, and that's the idea that you no longer have a social order that makes it clear to people how they should integrate themselves with their different parts. So how you put together your work life and your family life and your hobbies, how you put together your Christian identity with your social identity and your individual identity, right? And so it is very difficult to figure out how to find integration. If there are no givens on what you should do, if it's all creative possibility, then there's a lack of direction. You can think of like a direction crisis. So there's another meaning of the meaning crisis that I think is rooted in a history of different sociologists that I think is very interesting. That is quite important because you have this problem that Tyler's bringing out of how does one figure out how all the parts of themselves go together. I think we see that with Nietzsche as well. Like, how do you integrate with yourself? And a critique that he has of classical morality is that it doesn't necessarily help you figure out. It helps you figure out what you shouldn't do. You know, you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't do these things, but how do you put yourself together? Now, I will note as a little caveat to all that, like, you know, obviously his big critiques are of, say, Christianity. You know, Christianity's ethical code is not merely the Sermon on the Mount. You also have Jesus say, take care of the orphans, or try to be like this little girl sitting on my knee. And that would actually, I think, start to get into a kind of deeper nobility ethic, not just a good and evil ethic, but I would have to elaborate on that. But again, the other thing, if we're talking about that in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche says in, I think, in the part where he talks about an attempt at self-criticism, he has this part where he says, the problem with Christianity is that it's a moral philosophy, it's not an aesthetic philosophy. And his whole thing is some sort of aesthetic way of life, which gets into dancing, which gets into nobility, which gets into timing. Now, if one buys this critique of Nietzsche or not, that's a different matter. But basically, a way to put it is, you know, one would bring up a Hans Balthasar or different theologians of the beautiful that would come forth. But anyway, the notion is that aesthetics has a lot to do with the ability of integrating one's wants and wills, integrating their different parts into a dancing whole, finding that different timing to be a full human being, and the tendency of man, which is fragmentary, the overman is able to overcome that fragmentation, right? And to figure out how to do all those things. But that gets into particularity, that gets into awareness, all of which is not easy to do and requires facing anxiety and fear and different things like that. And then the closing point, and then I'll give it to whoever wants to speak. If by the meaning crisis, we mean a loss of the sociological conditions that help people determine an aesthetic way of life that's left them completely devoid with simply negative philosophies, that don't give them integration, that just gives them a clearing, but they don't know how to integrate in that clearing, that is a valid thing. So there's a sociological dimension, but then there's the question of the meaning crisis on the individual level. And that's indeed where I think we get into the critique of where meaning is a byproduct. We have to get into the story of meaning, as Mr. Luber and I have been talking about. Mr. Luber has done some tremendous voice memos describing that, and I salute him because I have forced him like a slave just whip a whip to do that, and he has. So anyway, Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. Feel free.
You're really funny. I'm on set right now, so I like kind of walked off just because I'd rather listen to this conversation than honestly be on set right now. But I just wanted to say something that a question really that Tyler made me think of with what he was talking about, watching the political arena and not really being in the political arena. I wonder how that is. Like, I feel like most philosophers watch the political arena and kind of don't take into account how they're in the political arena by watching, in a sense. Like, what is the relationship between watching the political arena and actually being in the political arena and being watched from a philosopher or from a bird's eye view, so to speak? Just a question I wanted to throw out there. I personally am confused with myself about that because I find myself watching the political arena, but then I say to myself, how am I not a part of it? Like, why do I keep thinking to myself that I'm watching and not a part of it? I have to be a part of it, but I don't agree with pretty much every dogmatic position that the political arena kind of gives. So it's just like a weird place where I feel like philosophers are part of it, but they're not part of it. What exactly is going on there? I'll pass it off to whoever.
Yeah, so the same so the critique that I would make of Nietzsche is exactly that the conveyance of experience is always both implicit and explicit, right? And so my reception of the aesthetic qualities of Christianity can be received via text or gossip or sitting alone in a cathedral when a choir is chanting some Gregorian musicality. So there's a very different sensory experience associated depending on context and how I'm receiving it. And it's always this extraordinarily interesting, especially in Christianity, mishmash of prior states of aesthetic that have been acquired and transmitted along the way. But precisely how the way the church unfolded and the way all these things seem to unfold, the way that the war develops is, the shadow element is created by the observer unobserved, right? It's literally the veil of influence on the whole, which is unobserved by some small part. And the further those two camps separate, the more the tension between them, right? And so this is why the Protestant Reformation was this schismatic event, which was an attempt to reclaim the causal efficacy of the one hierarchical advantage over the other, right? They're trying to pull it back into themselves so that their will might more appropriately affect their desires, something like that. And that's always happening. It seems anywhere you look, any space which has some common aim or goal, it seems to begin to separate into these two camps over time, based on differential capacities at both seeing and manipulating the patterns within that space, right? Like how well one is able to receive and then manipulate the tokens of advantage within, right, the resources available to you, which produces the expertise niche cycle, and then those who cannot are driven to the edges, and that's your shadow, right? That's the accumulative critical interpretation of the positive. So it's you invert the value structure, and then you attempt to establish a new moral system based on that inverted value structure. And that's that's, the revolutionary cycle. So maybe this is all Hegelian and all, but that's, I think essentially we could probably describe from cognitive science terms what's occurring in the mind itself, the way that the hemispheres are processing information, and that's a hefty claim to back up, but I think we can kind of show something like that now.
Well, first off, it's elections are coming up in Virginia here, Andrew. So I feel that way on this tension between you're in, you're watching, you're not part of. What does it look like? Indeed, that's quite difficult. Second, I have this image of you throwing your script off and walking off stage. Really great image. I really like that. So that's really nice. Also, too, on the kind of the notion of the, it's interesting to think like where, there's a lot of work today from, say, a Moltmann theologian, N.T. Wright, Surprised by Hope is Resurrection, where there's really kind of a push on what was the meaning of the phrase, the kingdom of God. And all of them are kind of stressing that it did not mean a Platonic realm, that it meant resurrection, that heaven is actually a dimension of this life. It's not separate, and that it has to be realized and come out, right? And that's and so it's kind of fighting against Gnosticism. It's really sort of bringing forth a incarnational or Trinitarian ontology. So the question, though, becomes, if there was no Nietzsche that had this strong critique of Platonic Christianity, would there have been the drive? Would there have been the sort of emphasis for there to be theological work to deconstruct a Platonist reading of Christianity, which then, funny enough, ends up actually, I've been convinced, if you actually go to the original language on the phrase the kingdom of God, or go into what resurrection and these different things mean, it's actually quite funny. It's quite clear that actually resurrection is not the same as a flight from the world, like a Gnostic leaving from the world, right? So there's this interesting way in which this critique actually results in this going back and reclaiming something that then helps you overcome the critiques, the valid critiques of Nietzsche, but in a manner that actually brings out Christianity to the fullness of what it should arguably supposedly be. And it's kind of interesting to think of the Nietzsche having this kind of topsy-turvy, because we were mentioning at the beginning, with Hegel on, if you push good to a certain point, it actually can reverse and become the bad, because you're taking it outside of the context where the good is noted as good. It makes me think of Bertrand Shaw once said on the phrase, where Jesus, they teach, do to your neighbor what you want, do unto others what you want done unto you. And he's like, yeah, but what if other people don't like it? What if other people don't like what you like having done unto you, done unto them, right? So, and the point he was getting at is that there has to be a certain awareness of where the limits of that principle come up. Yeah, maybe it applies generally to don't murder, don't kill, or whatever. But when it comes to, say, going to the movies, you like going to the movies, but they may not like going to the movies, right? So you won't, the phrase, do unto others what you want done unto yourself, you would have to make sure that you don't overfit it, right? That you don't take it too far. Well, that would require a certain awareness of different things. So likewise, there's this willing to hold yourself back that actually leads to a proper application, in the same way that Nietzsche critiquing Christianity can force it to kind of withdraw and then rethink and then actually reformulate itself, so that it just doesn't continue to go deeper into Gnosticism that Kierkegaard was critiquing. And that might result in a shrinking or a certain sort of deconstruction, but that actually can give rise to kind of a stronger core and something that's more integrated together. With that, I will give it to Javier Rivera. The last thing I'll say is, for me, an interesting reading of the famous parable of the madman. Because remember, everyone in the circle is an atheist, right? It's not that he's talking to Christians. He's talking to people that don't believe anymore. A way to read that can be that Nietzsche is saying that there are actually mechanisms in Christianity that result in people no longer believing in it, even if they think they believe in it. And that God died because there was not an awareness of what those expiration dates were within, say, Christianity, right? Well, then the question becomes, could you reform those? Could you change those? Could you address those? Because that then would be what one would be doing. And if you remove Gnosticism or you remove the Platonism, would that be a way to remove the expiration date tendency that could be there? And that's one way to read it, because, again, it's very important. Like, you have people that are nominally Christian or that are atheists. So the madman is not necessarily talking to Christians telling them that God is dead. The madman is analyzing something that has already occurred that people either A, don't think is a big deal, or B, don't realize the massive implications of this, or C, don't understand how the way that they believed in God actually had a way in distancing them from God without them realizing it. And that's then where you would examine Nietzsche as a kind of reformant force that would be at play at that, and then could potentially bring by a thinking of religion that is following an ethic of nobility as opposed to simply an ethic of not doing evil, which is too negative, and that seems to be something that Nietzsche was critiquing. But let me give it to Javier.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I always like Nietzsche. This is like the irony that I love about Nietzsche so much, which you basically are basically saying, Daniel, where Nietzsche's emphasis on being an enemy rather than a friend, right? This notion of being an enemy to Christianity, is actually feeding the progress of Christianity itself. And that's sort of like the irony in Nietzsche. So that's why I'm always like a little bit like hesitant to call him like completely, you know, against Christianity fully in every sense. I mean, because there is this way in which if you portray yourself as the enemy, you really do feed this withdrawal where Christianity now is going to feed itself into a new kind of theology, a new rethinking of what needs to be thought. And and this idea of like tension, and this is why I love this notion that I, you know, start thinking about tension relativity, because it is what seems to be the rhythm that demands another note in response. You know what I mean? Like the moment I play a note, somebody wants to give another note in that response, and then I must respond. And so we're making music together within the very moments of our tension. So there does seem to be this musicality going on between Nietzsche and Christianity that really pushes for a reevaluation of this. And I really like your notion of what resurrection is not an escape. There's been so much, because of Nietzsche, there has been so much that Christianity has now responded to. That kenosis, the term kenosis, has taken a crazy, crazy modern turn. I mean, you have Balthasar, right? You mentioned him. There's even, I was reading an article today about this, I think what is it, even Derrida, this notion of kenosis, of emptying language, right? Emptying language of its contents and going forth. Kenosis has taken such a strong, magnificent turn in terms of interdialogue between atheists, Christians, other religions. And I feel like Nietzsche kind of really fed this sort of tension, because kenosis now can be like this way where, you know, you have like this, what's his name? Master Eckhart, where he's saying, you know, I just hope that I can let go of God, right? So there's this whole notion where now it's like almost you can argue for a type of atheism, or a type of oscillating atheism between Christianity and atheism, where, you know, a man has to wrestle with God. And I actually think that the real Christianity actually lies in the story of Jacob, where it's like the death of God is the fact that you're not wrestling with God anymore. And so that means to be a Christian that sort of accepted it, he's no longer living in tension, so he's just nominally Christian. And then the atheist that sort of just accepts the death of God, again, he's not living in tension, so he's just accepting it. So there's this notion of wrestling with God that I feel like Nietzsche is sort of advocating for, which is funny because in the story of Jacob, his friends always try to tell him like the reasons why this is happening, right? But the moment you actually accept those reasons, you actually dissolve the tension. You say, well, it's probably because you did something wrong, Jacob. That's why, you know, God's punishing you, right? But Jacob refuses to accept this explanation, right? So he's living in tension throughout the whole entire book of Jacob. So I really do feel like Nietzsche brings back the notion of wrestling with God. Is it Job? Is it Job or Jacob? I might have been, you know, that's fine. I'm causing tension.
Well, no,
I ended there.
That's perfect in an even better way than you could realize, because this is essentially where we get the name of Israel, and Israel means to wrestle with God. And that is an essential component. You remember, Judas was invited into the 12. His treachery was known. And I truly, I think this is the only way you can arrive at that problem of needing to hold the tension that the golden rule doesn't always apply. We do this by retaining within us the other. And it can only be that which we can't see, right? Because if we were to see it, we know it. And then we identify with it and we try to control it. And so it has to be perpetually veiled. That's our shadow. And yet it also has to have some causal efficacy over us so that we can't ignore it. And by this means, I think we are continuously accumulating and carrying around with us this persistent remembrance that we have to do this balancing act all the time, perpetually, right? So that persistent atheism is something like the radical doubt that you are always obtaining, no matter how far you fling yourself into the shadows, because to presume anything above yourself and therefore unknowable is to presume that you cannot know it, right? This is a kind of agnosticism that we also call atheism, just because we have an emotive conjugation we need to do. But that ability, that inability rather, to firmly fix and refer to perpetually, no matter where you arrive at, this idea of something always beyond, right? That you can't get around it. That is always, the more you know, the more you also must presume is forever outside. Otherwise, it just destroys the whole process. I don't know what integration actually is, in fact, right? In that sense, it seems to me like the problem that occurred in our modern Christian church, and that is always occurring, is that some purity standard is defined. And that begins to hold overdue, outsized influence, let's say, on the capacity for the new, for novelty, which is the only reason we're conscious in the first place, right? To select from choice, to choose. It seems to be the only reason for it to exist at all. It's to be able to look out beyond, see paths and make a decision. Yeah. And yet we are always undermined by our shadow.
Very well put. And Mr. Fishman, always good to see you. Hi, Rude. I hope you're doing well. I'll pass it on to Mr. Luber in a moment. I think the connection between Job and Jacob is very, very good. G.K. Chesterton had a great part on Job, which is very interesting because the friends of Job come along and give like theological explanations for why bad things are happening to a good person. And God shows up and he's like, Job is my servant. He's not trying to justify this. He's just accepted that he's not trying to create kind of a hermeneutic or theological interpretation that tries to understand that in finite terms. And so there's a way in which the very act of Job not accepting certain theological explanations actually honor God more, because it creates an opening for the surprising action and unknown activity of God, which is like, boom, God's here and he's ready to wrestle you now. Oh, I didn't know God liked to wrestle. Okay. This boom kind of come in, and are you able to respond appropriately to that unknown? It would seem as if integration is the ability to be integrated enough with yourself to be able to handle the wrestling match, to be able to handle the temptation to look for a explanation that makes God's action something that you can understand or put in finite terms, where you don't have to be open to the unknown of God. And it seems to be Job and Jacob in that way are very good. And it's interesting to think of Jesus bringing into the fold, like into the deepest and most profound fold, a mechanism of betrayal. Like, and then like, he's like, that mechanism of betrayal is somehow part of the plan, is part of what Jesus is going to do. And that's very profound. And can you be the kind of being who can handle, say, bringing Issachar, bringing Judas into the fold, calling an enemy a friend, and seeing that as somehow challenging you, because Nietzsche seems to be bringing that out, and that's going to be the kind of fold, but that's going to require a certain integration and ability to wrestle. That's where I think Nietzsche comes in. That comes facing fear, rising to the occasion, fighting, and his concern, his valid concern, is that some classical notions of ethics allows people to be good men without doing that work, without even thinking they need to do that work, without even believing that that work has a role to play. And that's where, complexifying goodness with a notion of nobility or honor or, you know, those higher kind of notions of character, I think is useful. But let me pass it with that to Mr. Luber, who I now want to envision walking to the other side of the set and kicking over some giant stuffed animal that's part of the show or something. I see Mr. Luber doing that.
Thank you for inviting us here today. So which of us wants to play Judas? This is the question.
Javier's dog.
I was gonna make a very edgy joke because I'm the only probably Jewish person in the Zoom, but I'll play Judas.
Yeah, it's gonna have to be you.
So I really like this conversation, and real quick, Daniel, that's literally what I am doing. I just went to like this other building and just like hid away in this like little office right here. But anyway, so I really like this conversation of tension. To me, it's like, now I just listening about Hegel, to me, and I feel like this is very like a Heidegger like move. When I hear about the dialect, I don't understand what this dialect is toward. Like, it seems like the conversation is, we talk about what the dialect is, but not in the sense of what it's toward. And like, to me, it's like this tension, this dialect is toward death. So like having that in mind, God, from what it seems like, created a tension toward death until it didn't. In the sense that the tension that God did give was met frequently to the point where it stopped becoming tension, it seemed like. So it made me honestly think of the whole like Kanye situation a little bit. If you guys are familiar with like what's happening with him, like, yes, like there's aspects of what he's saying that's absolutely like crazy and whatnot, but like I've been like kind of following it, and like there is like a certain aspect, a certain thinking that like I do agree with, not necessarily like the Jewish stuff, but I understand in a sense like what he's talking about in terms of just feeding, just giving a one possible ground for the situation to be standing on. And like him having an issue with a narrative that's just basically one possible narrative, where to me, and this is, I would say, very speculative, but like so Judaism is the first monotheistic religion, and monotheism is basically one belief system about God, about the ultimate ground in which we stand on. So when that one ground, so to speak, got revealed to be just one ground in a certain sense, people stopped buying into the whole notion of God. So to me, like, when we're talking about a tension toward death, it needs to be dynamic in a sense that it's not deriving from a singular place. Like God, like, can be understood in a very complex way, but in a certain context, it's like Heidegger talks about how being with a capital B got morphed into, like in time, it got changed into God, and that God is just B with a capital B. And like his kind of critique is that God kind of denotes like a lack of dynamic, like being is more dynamic. It seems like it's more ambiguous, the ground, than God. God seems to give us a very firm conception of where our life comes from. So I just think when we talk about this tension and this tension toward death, we need to talk about it in a very dynamic way. And I just don't know if the notion of God as a whole fits that. And I feel like Vervaeke's talked about this when he talks about non-theism. And that if you look at meaning in the world in the way that he talks about it, when you look at God, it doesn't give that dynamicness that the transjective point of view, so to speak, gives off.
Well, thank you for bringing in Kanye. That's good for the algorithm. And I will note that both Balthasar and Marion, who I think are premier theologians, One, like Balthasar was kind of sick to the gut with a lot of scholasticism because it turned God into like the God of Plato and Aristotle, first movers and whatever, and wasn't alive. And for Marion, the concept of being is a threat to God because God is a supersaturated phenomenon that always transcends categories of being. So the critique that you're making, I think, on some of what I consider, and then I'll give it to Mr. Fishman, on some of the great theologians, that's like one of their main things, is to kind of pull apart. Where Heidegger thought God threatened the concept of being, they kind of believe that being threatens the concept of God, and so want to kind of pull it apart. So I think that what you were saying right there, Mr. Luber, is very good. Mr. Fishman, good to see you, sir. Hope you're doing well.
Good to see you too. I'm doing well. Let's see. Okay, so first of all, I'm just jumping into this conversation now, so I don't know exactly what came before, but in terms of Job and Jacob, I think there is a deep relationship between Job and Jacob, right? They both wrestle with God in like a very fundamental sense. And as you're saying, Job refuses to accept any sort of rest in his mind, right? Because in his mind, he's like, why am I being punished? I was righteous, right? And his friends are offering him these explanations. He says, no, like that, like I will continue to wrestle with God until there is resolution, right? And the resolution comes not in the form of an answer, but in the form of the revelation of God, right? God's answer to Job is not this is why I'm punishing you. He doesn't say, like, he doesn't give a theological answer. He just says, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth, right? You don't know. And at the end, it says, I forget exactly how it's worded, but it's basically like Job was satisfied, right? He was comforted. There was resolution in his soul. And yet he didn't receive an intellectual answer, right? And so what it's saying is through wrestling with God, there is the possibility of an intimate connection with God. Not that you will receive an answer that will satisfy you forever, right? And then with Jacob, like, to me, there's such a deep mystery in the story of Jacob, because he wrestles with the angel of God at night alone by the river, right? He doesn't, like, there's two kinds of wrestling, you know what I mean? There's wrestling that you do with your enemy in the battlefield, and then there's the wrestling that you do with your lover at night alone in your tent, right? And with Jacob, it's this liminal space. He's not in his tent, he's down by the river. And so it's outside, and yet it's at night, and it's like this intimate struggle with the angel of God, right? And so, like, there is, and you know, especially if you take this in context with the Jewish understanding of like the Song of Songs as a metaphor for the relationship between God and the soul, if you take in the Kabbalistic notion of the Ein Sof and the Shekhinah, then like the wrestling with God, there is the possibility of sublimation from a fight to a sexual union, right? And so, let's see. Where does this lead to? Okay, so I'm also Jewish, Andrew, at least by heritage. I don't practice Judaism, so I suppose it's on us to play Judas here. Judas did what he was told, right? Unlike Peter, who was constantly crossing the will of Jesus, right? Jesus said to Peter, I will go down to Jerusalem and be crucified. And Peter said, I will not let that happen, right? And Jesus said, stand behind me, Satan. Unlike Judas, Jesus said to Judas, you will betray me. And Judas said, okay, right? He didn't put up a fight. He said, okay, if like thy will be done, right? And so Judas did exactly what he was told, and in doing so, set off the Christian story, right? At the command of Jesus. And so again, I'm not a Christian, but like there's deep mystery to Judas as well. And so I guess that's all I have to say. I would just bring up the mystery in these stories.
I really like the combination of sex and wrestling, Hyru. That's good for the algorithm too. So that's really good.
Yeah.
And the Gospel of Judas is pretty crazy as a text. But let me pass it on to Javier there.
So I'm so happy that Fishman is bringing this up, because I totally love the notion of Judas. And this is something that I thought about, like, I think like 2 years ago, but I was thinking about like, why isn't there enough like exegesis on Judas, even in a philosophical context? Because I think the role of Judas is such a mysterious and like crazy role that even in the supper, right, Judas is the closest to Jesus in that moment. That is like the crazy part. He is the closest to Jesus in that moment, just like right by his ear. So even if we take Judas as like the example of like tension, the sort of necessary tension that needs to exist, it's almost like the tension itself is what shows how close you can be to God in some sense. And actually, you show yourself participating in that very role of God's sort of like self-sacrifice and so on. So it's interesting when we look at Judas as like a character in the Bible, and his role to play. And even Peter, it's almost like Peter doesn't quite understand, like, and I love Fishman's point right here, like Peter tries to almost dissipate the tension, like, no, this isn't going to happen. I'm not going to let this happen, Jesus, you know? And yet Jesus points to him and says, like, look, man, this is going to happen anyways. You're going to deny me 3 times. He's like, no way, you know? But he's going to do it anyways, because that's his role. That's his tension in the part of the story. But I think a little deeper look is that Peter starts to see the tension within himself in terms of like, there's no way that this is possible, that I'm going to participate in this part, you know, prediction. And yet, once he realizes that he completely denies him, it completely like humbles him. You know, it just completely opens his eyes to like some self-realization, which is very important for Peter to deny Jesus in this case. But yeah.
It's interesting. So a few things with Judas, like there's the notion of he goes to the high priest, I believe, before Jesus says he's going to betray him and says, you know, what would you give me if I did it? Then there's the idea that he commits suicide afterwards, where he's kind of racked by guilt. And there's also kind of an interesting thing where there's one interpretation that can be when Jesus kind of tells Judas, you're going to betray me. It's like Jesus is like, hey, you're not going to surprise me. I know this is going to happen, and I'm allowing it to happen. Right. But there is also a kind of interesting notion. I always wonder with that, because I think it's at the Last Supper that occurs. Did the other people hear that? You know, they're like, do they just sit there and do nothing? And like, that's always been kind of interesting to me, because I think it is in the Last Supper where Jesus is like, where Judas says something like, you don't mean me, do you? And Jesus is like, you said it. You know, you said that stuff. And then they just sit there, which is very interesting. And one wonders if the other 11 are so kind of shell-shocked, or they're like, nah, that can't mean what we think it means, or they're just allowing it. Are they in a way participating in the betrayal by not, say, sacking Judas and like taking him to prison? There's like a lot of interesting questions that emerge with that. But then there's also a question of, if Judas knows that Jesus knows he's going to betray him, does Judas kind of fall into that in a sort of obedient spirit, or is it a denial spirit? There's a lot of interesting questions that emerge. But the main thing is that I think there's a kind of complexification between the roles of friend, disciple, follower. The foundation of the church doesn't, you know, the rock of the church doesn't want to allow Jesus to go through with the crucifixion, which all shows a level of a destabilizing element that is constantly going on in the story. And I think that destabilization is very important, because Mr. Lewitt, you know, this question has arisen on where does the dialectic go, right, in Hegel? Like, does it go somewhere? It's a very, very, very good question. So there's a few things, you know, for Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, you're always already in absolute knowing. You know, you don't follow the dialectic. The dialectic is simply a recount of the history of how you got to where you already are. But you're not going anywhere from the dialectic. You actually have to move from there into speculative reason. So for Hegel, and Dimitri brings this up quite a bit, and I think it's very important, the dialectic doesn't tell you what to do. It's a description of how concepts, just like Tyler was saying earlier, eventually the concept of freedom cannot be pushed any further without creating anarchism. And then you have to bring in equality. But then if you push equality too much, it gets to the point where it's, say, there's no excellence. But then if you have too much excellence, you can get into eugenics, you know. And so every single concept, every single value, every single everything eventually has a point where it destabilizes or necessitates limit in of itself. The dialectic is bottom up, not top down. People get the impression that Hegel came up with the dialectic and started seeing everything in its terms, when really he's like, if you phenomenologically observe how things unfold, there naturally comes a point where if you have too much freedom, you don't have society. I didn't decide that. That's what happens. Eventually, freedom has to be balanced with, say, beauty or family, right? Because once you're in a family, there's a kind of limit on your freedom, right? You can't just go and do anything. You have responsibility. But then Hegel's like, but in that responsibility to family, there's a sublimation of the freedom you had before into something that can be higher if you meet the condition of being able to exercise that sublation without it turning into something that psychologically destabilizes you and different things. So the dialectic is in things, and he's just simply observing how it arisen. And then the whole philosophy of Hegel becomes basically the speculative reasoning of what it means that that is the case. Like, what does it mean, that thing? Like, what is the nature of the being of epistemology if things naturally have a destabilizing element within them? And that's where you get into the science of logic. So it's just really important to note that the dialectic is a kind of, yes, it is a kind of epistemological tool. It is a kind of way of thinking, but it is also a description of the natural limitation that things kind of have in themselves. In the same way that it's kind of funny, if there is no betrayal of Jesus, we probably wouldn't know who Jesus was today, right? It's precisely that betrayal, that sort of hitting of the limits of the fellowship of, fellowship of the ring, right? The discipleship that then leads to its sublimation into this massive movement that has changed the world forever. But with that, I'll give it to Tyler and then Mr. Luber.
Go pick up the kids, but yeah, if we homogenize through some purity test, we lose the capacity to adapt, right? You homogenize to inflexibility, and the changing world around you will eventually overcome you. So the only way to be adaptive to it is to be aware of it, to bring it in other words, right? To face it, confront it, and to allow it to inform you, right? To actually reshape you. The form of yourself is truly changing. And so the degree to which one is able to adapt to the changing world and all its vicissitudes is the degree to which you are willing to imbibe suffering, right? The limits of your suffering, in some sense, are the limits of your capacity to change in response to what's occurring. The resurrection was after the crucifixion. It's the renewal of any body seems to be as a consequence of the testing of its limits. And I don't know how we can get around that. I don't think we can. And I feel like in physics they have things called no-go theorems. Any social theorem which attempts to go in this direction, I would say, hard no. It's been very enjoyable. Wonderful thoughts. Thank you.
I love you, Tyler. You're a really beautiful soul.
I'm grateful that you fellows were willing to take the Judas role today, though.
Yeah.
Dang,
You always say
dang.
great things. Thank you.
Tyler, you're a beautiful soul.
Next time.
So a few things. So I just want to make a comment actually on what Tyler said. I don't think it's about trying to exceed the limit. Yes, people have been focusing on how to get around, like you said, getting around the limit. But to me, that limit is just localized. It's just in a certain region. So it's not about necessarily getting around the limit, but finding a different limit. So and what I mean by that is just like, not to bring up Heidegger again, I feel like Javier with Buber now. Basically, when something is unconcealed to us, in that very unconcealment, we are being essentially trapped in concealment in a certain way. So like when something's revealed to us, it kind of brings our flashlight, it makes our focus on that thing that's revealed, but that's only one possible thing that's revealed. And there could be other possible things that are revealed that absolutely, in my mind, contradict that possible thing that we were revealed to. Not saying that the initial thing that you were revealed to is not the truth. It's just that the truth from our perspective can be extremely contradictory if we discover, multiple truths, so to speak. And that's the conversation I kind of wanted to steer toward, which is like discovering multiple truths. And that to me is how we quote unquote get around the limit, is just by establishing the fact that yes, there's a limit over at A, and now let's find, well, it's not really let's just find, but it's just understanding that that's just a localized limit, and understanding that there's this eminence that exceeds that limit. And if we put ourselves in the right position, if we think in a proper way, we can open ourselves up to the possibility of another limit revealing itself to us. That's kind of what I just wanted to say with Tyler's comment. And then I just have a few questions with Daniel, what you were saying about Hegel. So I totally get the emergence aspect of the dialectic. Like if you were to take our conversation right now, like the conversation emerges from us coming together. It's not something that like is necessarily preordained, right? Like that Hegel's not thinking like this dialectic is preordained in that emanation way. It reveals ourselves. It reveals itself to us. It seems like is what Heidegger and Hegel would agree with that. To me, so is it like the dialectic itself is already in its end? So it's like the second that dialectic like emerges, that's its end right there in the emergence itself. Because if it's not going anywhere per se, then it's already arrived. Is that basically am I understanding that right? Or
well, there's a funny way that the moment you realize that something is dialectical, then there must have been a dialectical process that you have observed and realized that therefore you're realizing it, as opposed to saying that that's how things go. Like, for example, if I say that the concept of freedom in of itself eventually reaches a point where there's too much freedom and now you have anarchism or you're existentially overwhelmed, then that's saying that freedom has that in of itself, that it will eventually reach that point, right? So the dialectic is in it. Now there's the unfolding of it through time, where say if you have a nation that say really stresses freedom to the point of all other values, and then it can kind of unfold. But the fact that freedom eventually has that destabilizing element is always in freedom. Right? Now, there's a difference between the people who realize that and therefore say, okay, we can't just have a political system that's created on the value of freedom. It also has to be in concert with other values. And then there's the people who don't realize that, and therefore they just push, say, hard libertarianism, various forms. Then you would have to get into what we mean by libertarian. But at the point where then you have, say, maybe an unregulated market that then leaves it possible for, say, too big to fail entities and so on and so forth. So there is practical difference between the realization of the dialectical nature of values and not realizing it. But there is a sense in which if the dialectic does indeed accurately describe things, it is realized, it is not imposed upon the world. However, if you understand that values have, say, a dialectical character in them, you may then design a government structure that is more likely to be in the image and likeness of that dialectical, onto that state of things. So there can be a creative consequence of the realization of the dialectic. And arguably, if indeed things are dialectical in their nature, you should create aware of that dialectical, because otherwise you're going to be creating systems or institutions or families or whatever that are against the nature of reality. And that's going to create a break that could give rise to a lot of trouble. So you have both of those going on, right? Like if reality is deeply dialectical, once you realize that, that's going to change how you carry yourself in the world and how you create things. But that's kind of a different, that's kind of the consequences of realizing the dialectic. So that's how I would apply it. And Dimitri, you missed the part where we talked about sex and wrestling. I'm really sorry. We talked about sex and wrestling. That would have been great. So that would be one thing I would say, Mr. Lewis.
So real quick, so it seems like that was well said. So the Hegelian, when the Hegelian does art, let's say, it's coming from that latter dialectic explanation that you just gave. It's coming from that. It's coming from like, okay, now let's create that government system because something's realized to you. So like at that point of creation, that's when like the artistic choice is going to occur. And that has to do with what my understanding would be speculative reasoning. Like at that point, you're speculating what needs to occur based off of the realization of the dialect.
I think that's
is that right?
I think that's very fair. You know, the
Okay.
complexity would be that you would also do this thing. Let's take Nietzsche, who says, hey, the reason Greek tragedy was so good is because there's these dialectical forces of Dionysus and Apollo, and Dionysus is not always good. If it's totally released, he talks about that in attempts of self-criticism. It becomes a force of destruction. So there's this realization of, wait a minute, if you follow the history of good art, there seems to be always already some sort of dialectical structure that's going on. So you kind of realize that, and then future art that you create, if you realize that that's the character of good art, you can be more intentional about the creation of art that has that element and that dialectical tragedy that's going off, those trade-offs of competing forces. So you can in a way become more efficient, you know, you can become more focused on the creative act. So, you know, that's the other thing. It's like the realization, like going through history, like historical studies becomes a realization of there being a way things unfold that are dialectical, that is different from and arguably better than things that don't realize that the dialectic should be incorporated and therefore say seek a perfect state and A is A and end up in effacement. So you have the streams end up overlaying and kind of merging together in different ways.
I'm really, the past few weeks, really been seeing the similarities between Heidegger and Hegel from what I'm like hearing. And to me, it's like Heidegger saw the dialectic, but he saw it through death. He focused on death, and that's how the dialectic was realized. The realization of the real was realized, so to speak. So where Hegel seems to come at it from kind of phenomenologically talking about how the dialectic emerges, where like I always thought Heidegger's Dasein was like from an emerging perspective, but hearing it in relation to Hegel, it seems like Heidegger seems more, there's something eminent about Heidegger, where he's kind of giving some like eminent take on like Hegel's emerging dialectic. So I just think with the Hegelian, don't they get trapped with, like, I understand the absolute knower knows its limit, and that's what makes them the absolute knower, but doesn't that still allow them to get trapped in a local region of thinking? Like, it doesn't allow the Hegelian to break out of that localized region, because they're not necessarily focused on like nihility, but they're focused on the dialect that like nihility is like also expressing, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, I'm extremely interested on doing something, and then I'll pass it to Javier on. I know Heidegger wrote a book on the phenomenology of spirit on Hegel. I have not read said book. I would be very curious what it has to say. I think there is indeed a role of death in Heidegger that is, he talks about it as the kind of mountain range of being that creates a certain dialectical structure to Heidegger. I do think that perhaps a difference, because this, my impression is that this gets into the weeds of the very particular details of the differences between the thinkers, right? And it would seem as if for Hegel, the limit ultimately is going to be, since you kind of create the limit, you therefore have power over the limit, and it's an imposed limit on yourself that is very similar to like where Nietzsche was talking about your good and evil, and then you wear the chain of the law and you treat that good and evil you select as if it is authoritative over you, right? That it has a drive, it's chosen, but it's not arbitrary, which is a very strange, it is very, very difficult to get to the mental state where you know you are choosing something and could choose other things, and yet to treat it as if it is some kind of like absolute law or whatever. You know it's not, but it has that same practical authority over you. So likewise, there's the awareness of the certain limitation of thinking that results you in ultimately having to make a choice. I like to talk about the real choice, and to be concrete and to manifest that, say, into your locality, and to actually then treat that as concrete, as real, and to live that out, and to not just stay in the realm of, say, the universal, right? There may ultimately be a difference between this final step in Hegel on putting the emphasis on the final step on the concrete, whereas for Heidegger, there may be more emphasis on maintaining an openness to the unfolding of being. I am not sure. That's a kind of speculative thought that I would have to consider, but that there may be a difference there.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, forgive me if I'm absolutely doing Hegel dirty. Like, I'm just basing it off of the little I've read and what I hear from other people.
My friend, no one here has read all the books they need to have read. There's always realms we're wondering about. And also all of these thinkers are, like, when you get into questions like that, it gets into, like, I think a lot of nitty gritty details that are not self-evident and not easy. So please ask away. And Dimitri, I was saying, we were all talking, Chitan was here in Thailand. We were talking about as the pre-conference to the Nietzsche conference. And we were all talking about our Nietzsche papers that I'm in a cold sweat because I understand I'm supposed to present on Sunday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Haven. He's going to be reading sections out of Thus Spoke Zarathustra while I crawl under the desk. So we were going to do that. I'm looking forward to it. But Javier, I'll let you speak. And if anyone has final things to say, please, as we come up toward the end. So Mr. Javier.
Yeah, I think I like Andrew's questions here. It almost makes me think when he's questioning the idea of like a localized limit. And this, I think, goes back to what Tyler was saying, where it's like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, I could be misinterpreting you here, but it's almost like you're saying, like, once we discovered the limit, like, how do we know that's our actual limit, so to speak? Like, how do we know that that's what it actually is?
Yeah, that's definitely, I'm getting at that for sure. Okay,
good. So, and I think, I think this is something that, I've been definitely struggling with too when I was thinking about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche and Zarathustra talks about, the overman needs to sort of know his limits. But there seems to be like very few indicators about what this knowing of your limits, kind of what it looks like. But it's almost like, and just to combine like maybe Heidegger and Hegel a little bit, it's almost like when you play a note, like you just hear the first ding of a note on the piano, and you hear the echo of it slowly dissipate, yet that very echo is the opening and also reaching its limit, but then also indicating that you need to play another note if you want to start making music. So it's like, if the moment, it's almost like in a very Hegelian Heidegger way, it's like that very limit, once we realize that's a limit, that's the opening for another limit and for another opening, to which now we're making music, right? Now we're dancing, now we're playing along. So and I know I've been making all this metaphorically because I think I very much like the idea of Nietzsche's notion of dancing that I've been taking seriously. But then also to kind of bring Nietzsche in here, I know there's been a lot of talk about God and being, but I think Nietzsche, then this is my kind of controversial take, I think Nietzsche would approach it in the sense of, it's the fact that we possess being that we need to be responsible for being, right? And once we give any explanation to resolve that tension of us being responsible for being, God is dead, so to speak. That's kind of like my interpretation of this, where the moment that we resolve any tension of this between, me being not responsible for being, and I think this still kind of mends well with his kind of, ideas against universalism and a sort of like universal good and evil, whereas like you don't really know your particular. The moment you don't know your particular, you're not being responsible for being anymore. So it does raise that question that if we take responsible for being in relation to limits, it's almost like there always has to be a sort of moving limit going along. And I feel like correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but I feel like you're trying to get there with that, where it's like there needs to be like this moving limit, because the moment there is a limit, we cannot just stop there. There needs to be this constant going on. But then again, just to bring in Hegel, this gets very complicated, because it's like, well, we're always realizing the realization that keeps going. So, I mean, I don't know. But yeah, that's kind of my very superficial interpretation of Hegel there.
Real quick, I am definitely getting at that. I would even say that, like, the limit move, I would say from our perspective, there's multiple limits, and that the movement occurs between the multiplicity of the limits, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, and I'll just note, and then I'll give it to Dimitri. You know, once you realize that you can't say run a wedding venue by yourself, that you're limited, that then says you need to get help, right? Or that you need to make a relationship with Edwin or different people. So the limit also simultaneously points to a direction of action, right? Like it's not, when we talk about limit, unless we're talking about like the event horizon of being itself or something, you know, every limit also entails a certain direction, or it calls you toward a certain way that you then carry yourself in the being. And I think if I were to posit that, it's almost like both Heidegger and Hegel seem to be interested in this kind of clearing, this kind of opening, this kind of failure. But it's almost like with Hegel, there's a real emphasis that you have to be in the concrete doing to have the clearing occur or the opening occur, because then you see where it's there, and there's a real mechanism of practice in the tearing with the negative that people would say, which may be distinct from Heidegger, but I don't know. You know, that's where it gets into the weeds of the differences between those different thinkers. It would be interesting to explore, say, the differences between the making of the opening of the encounter and limit, say in Hegel between Heidegger, because both of them seem to be interested in a kind of encountering a space of failure that then opens up. You have to think in terms of category, but to the point of failure. Like the failure is actually part of the thinking. That's when the category opens up and unveils a new thinking that you have to engage in. So so failure is the mechanism of clearing. Whereas the mechanism in Heidegger, I'm not enough of an expert to say, would be interesting to explore the particular mechanisms of clearing, which arguably are very similar. But that gets into, you know, we talk about comparative literature. I guess we're talking comparative philosophy at this point. But I will give it to Dimitri and Mr. Fishman.
So Hegel has a distinction between limit, Grenze, and limitation, Schranke. A Grenze is like an external limit. The thing with Grenze is that, or limit, is that you don't know that that limit is there. So it's a kind of, you don't even know what you don't know. You see, it's this kind of unsurpassable external limit. The Schranke is immanent limitation. So then with Schranke, when you go from limit to immanent limitation, you know what you don't know. Now, the Kantian thing in itself is totally unknown and unknowable, but you are aware that you have access to transcendentally constituted reality, right? With the a priori categories and all that. So what's beyond that? Well, that's the noumenal thing in itself. And for Kant, this is I mean, it gets very complicated here, but to simplify it to the utmost, the noumenon for Kant is a positive external reality. Because I have senses, so there must be something out there. Because I have to receive input to my senses. The thing with Hegel is that Hegel also has Andrew, it would be interesting to look at infinity here, because yes, there's different kinds of limits. We deal in multiplicity when we're talking about ontology. But for Hegel, this beyond of Immanuel Kant, which has a kind of infinity, is spurious infinity. It's a bad infinity. Because all you can do is replace one phenomenal determination with the other. So in a sense, you can always posit another determination, and You can go on pointing to them all kinds of multiplicities or all kinds of phenomena, and then you have just gigantic multiplicity. I am not going to go into the true infinity now, that would be too much. I think, okay, one way we could see the true infinity is that what's missing in the bad infinity is the subject, so what's missing in the bad infinity is the very thing that is missing, lack as such, whereas in the true infinity, it's the self-relation of negativity that's infinite. It's a kind of parasitism on finitude as such, so it's nothing transcendent and beyond. The thing with multiplicity is that, I'm reading Sex and Filled Absolute by Zizek, and problems with ontology of multiplicity, like Deleuze not saying Deleuze was, not intelligent, he was a genius from what I know. But is that what you can do with positing multiplicity is that it must be posited with a backdrop of a one. And here, what Daniel would say, you efface the subject, you have a risk of, like covering over antagonism. So this is basically, I think, the basic problem with the bad infinity of multi that we can fall into. Yeah.
Thank you, Dimitri. And yes, I would definitely say that with the effacement. Another, and then I'll give it to Mr. Fishman. It's kind of like you have, let's say you have a circle, and you draw 2 points on that circle. The circle is relating to itself, then other points, and you could theoretically draw kind of infinite points on the circle, and you'd have infinite relations within the circle. And that's a different kind of infinity than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, forever. That would be kind of the bad infinity, the spurious infinity. What Hegel's interested in is these, like you said, these self-relating infinities and different things, which of course is interesting because, if in a way there's a circle between me and that bookcase, there's a way in which there's an infinity of self-relation that is going on because I can relate to it in so many different ways. But then you see, I myself cannot fully relate to myself. So there's a kind of lack that's going on there, but that comes out as a concept in the very notion of the self-relating infinity. So that's one of the ways but let me give it to Mr. Fishman. You're on mute, Mr. Fishman. You're on mute. No. One day, actually, everyone, by the way, we're going to have a music session. Mr. Fishman's going to do guitar. Javier is going to do Dance Dance Revolution. I'm going to do piano. It's going to be great. And Andrew's going to do the acting. It's all going to be great. We're going to have a great time.
Yeah, and we'll do it on Zoom, and there will be no lag, and it'll work perfectly. Okay, so I've never read Hegel or Heidegger, and so I'm not sure if what I'm about to say here will relate to those terms that people have just brought up, but like, when I think of limitation, I think about it from a rock climbing perspective, right? And so, like, I have a local limit of like what I can do right now, you know what I mean? And it is precisely by encountering that limit that there is a space in which I can engage with rock climbing, right? Because like walking up the stairs is nowhere near my limit, and so I don't even call that rock climbing. You know what I mean? It's just right? So in order to actually engage and wrestle with the activity, I have to encounter my limit, but then I have to push up against it, right? And I have to try and go beyond it by completing the route. And then once I complete that, once I reach my limit in that local sense, there is a death, there is a dissolution, right? Like I no longer, all of that libido that I have of like, I'm going to do this route suddenly dissipates, right? And I have to go search for another one. And so that's like the local limit by which progress can happen. And then you could think about like the limit of rock climbing as such, like what is, we don't know that limit, right? We don't know what the hardest thing anybody ever could do in history, right? But we wonder about that. Like, this is too hard for anyone to do right now, but maybe in 100 years, somebody will do it, right? And so when it comes to like breaking up limits, and I was thinking about this in relationship to something that Alex Ebert said on the net last time, is that like there is this process by which we assume an identity, but then as soon as we do that, we begin to feel the constraints of that identity, and there's a tendency to want to break out of it, right? And so it seems to me that from that position, once you start to bump up against the limits of your identity, there's essentially two moves that you can make. You can either say, like, I will change my identity for another one. And this is something that Daniel and I have talked about, is that like if I'm a rock climber and I'm beginning to run up against the limits of rock climbing as such within my own life, right? I'm sort of plateauing and I'm not progressing anymore and I'm starting to get bored of it. I could either say, well, I'm pushing up against the limits of my identity, so I'm going to change from being a rock climber to being a surfer, right? And I could go enter into a new identity and grow within that. Or I could negate the identity through repetition. I could say, today I'm a rock climber, but tomorrow I'm going to be a rock climber, right? And change the nature of the category itself and push not merely push my limits, but push the limits of the identity as such to create room for me to grow. And I think there is a time and a place for both of those, but ultimately, like, as the great philosopher Kenny Rogers once said, you have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, right? And so, like, you can fold your hand and pick up another one, but you'll never win anything that way, right? The only way through is to hold on to the tension and to change the game itself. And so, like, that's how I think about limits and negation. So yeah.
Well, Dimitri has an excellent quote on that that's sexy, and Javier also talks about Stacy to Honey Bear. That's sexy too, and we talked about wrestling and sex. So this is great. This is really good for the algorithm. And different things, but no, it is that interesting of relating. I really like what you just said, Hairut. And if anyone has any last things to say, please. On the notion of climbing stairs, you don't even think about it as rock climbing, right? That limitation creates definition. Like the butting up against limitation creates a sense of definition where, like, sure, you could even say go rock climbing up the mountain near my house, but I'm sure for an expert like you, it really wouldn't be rock climbing. It would be climbing up rocks, but it would not be rock climbing, right? You know, in order to be rock climbing, there's a certain difficulty, a certain intensity to it, of which you only may be able to do because you've climbed the rocks up the mountain over there, the hill over there. It's not even a mountain, it's a hill. But that encountering, relating of limitation creates definition. And that's interesting to think, because where there's limitation, there must be finitude. And that brings to mind Dimitri's quote there. Finitude relates to itself as a limit, then it overcomes that limit, which changes its definition of how it refers to that limit, on and on and on and on. And that creates this sort of infinity, which is very different from, say, Hegel would be extremely interested in that. He would not be so much interested. You could theoretically climb an infinite number of, you could climb the rocks of an infinite number of hills like the one out back, but Hegel would be like, nah, because there's no overcoming for someone like you, right? For you, that would just be taking a nice stroll. Maybe for me, it would be rock climbing, but for you, it would just be climbing up rocks, right? So you could add a spurious infinity of mountains that are just climbing up rocks for Hegel, and that would not be infinity for Hegel. That's just like, that's a large number. You know, that's a number that is not bracketed, but since it doesn't, here's the key. It's not a true infinity because there's no overcoming. There has to be overcoming to have a true infinity. In the kind of infinite, the bad infinity, it's continually doing over and over again, and maybe it's even different hills, but since it's of the same intensity level, since it's not encountering a limit for someone like you, it's a bad infinity, and it can't be a true infinity because there's no overcoming. So this is where the overcoming is a really big deal for Hegel. And then, of course, what's interesting is questions like you were pointing at this. Theoretically, surely there is some mountain that is the hardest of all possible mountains on planet Earth that you could climb, right? And theoretically, once you climb that, there's a sense in which you now have kind of reached the end of true infinity, right? This is kind of an interesting question. Hegel almost says that it's the nature of the unfolding of reality, if you grant me that phrase, to then somehow eventually create a tougher mountain later on. You're going to go to Mars next or something. You're going to go to Pluto. So even if on planet Earth there is some sort of hardest of all possible rock climbing, history will unfold in a manner where there is still yet. And that's why there's still a kind of true infinity that's going to come. And I think that points to where the limit is there and the limit is there and the limit is there. And then, of course, Hegel would say, yeah, but you haven't climbed up it yet with 10 pounds on your back. Yeah, though, you haven't climbed up it with like extra tasks, right? And so you could always theoretically create a new way to climb the hardest of all possible mountains in a way that would always have overcoming. But I'll put the emphasis, and then if anyone else has to say anything, please. The emphasis is that for Hegel, true infinity must have overcoming. And I actually think it's on this point that we can connect Hegel with Nietzsche, which is an overarching point of, of the philosophy portal conferences. Because Mr. Fishman, we were talking earlier, we have the Nietzsche conference coming up this weekend. So this is the pre-conference to the Nietzsche. So we were talking about Nietzsche at the beginning. So for Nietzsche, there's this kind of like the overman. The full human being is a being that overcomes man. Not like as a race, but like all of us have a dialectical tension between man and overman, and the overman overcomes the man, right? The last man, and so on and so forth. So there's a real sense in which the overman in Nietzsche can be connected with the true infinity of Hegel, because that true infinity is defined by a perpetual overcoming. And so I think the the ontology that Hegel is putting forth, I think, can go with Nietzsche. But on that, let me pass it around. And I will confirm that inflation did get to those tires last week where I had to replace them. I did find out that inflation had gotten to the mechanics. So it was great last week. But anyway, anyone have any final things to say? No pressure, except a ton of pressure. All the pressure in the world. You have to overcome yourselves.
I want to just add one thing onto what I was saying about limitation. And I want to address this idea of God as being that was brought up earlier. Andrew was talking about this. For me, God, like ontologically speaking, God is always beyond. Like God includes being and non-being, but transcends them and affords the relationship between them, right? God is the place where all other phenomena can interact with each other. And so it's always beyond. Like even to say God is the creator is not fully right, because there's the creator and then there's creation, and then there's that which includes but transcends creator and creation, and that's God. And so there is always that tension, because it's like there is the one, but the one is always beyond, because we're living in this particular time and place. And so that's just quickly, I just wanted to say that.
I just wanted to squeeze in. I don't want to make it into a whole nother conversation, but I think when I hear God, to me, there's a contingent off of a belief where I'm in the a priori, so to speak. So to me, once I say I believe this entity or this ground that created what I'm in, my belief, it seems that my belief is somehow separated from my inness. So when I hear God, to me, it's just discrediting how much I'm in it. And that's why probably Jewish people would say you don't say the word God or whatever, just because it kind of touches on that sentiment a little bit. And then with that said, it's like when you're doing the rock climbing, and I'm being like speculative here, and I'm trying to relate this to Heidegger and clearing a little bit. There's like a few assumptions a little bit that you're climbing like a mountain, that you're climbing something, like you're assuming there's, and like this sounds a little like, I guess, mystical or far-fetched in a certain sense, but you're assuming there's a certain trajectory. You're assuming like the mapping, like how the rock climbing is going to go. You already have an idea in your head before you started the rock climbing. So in that sense, like, what if what's actually there, like, is something slightly different than your assumption? And in that sense, the limit of your rock climbing might be like, it might be a little different than the limit of somebody else's conception of it. Like, it's possible that there's another entity with cognition that has a totally different conception of what's about to be climbed than you, and does it in a way that could potentially not even make sense to you. Like, what if like rock climbing, and I'm just kind of grasping at straws here, but like rock climbing, you're climbing up. Like, what if like their notion of like rock climbing is literally not up but down? I don't know, or like through instead of outside and up, if that makes any sense. So like, to me, with limit, like I love the analogy of the rock climbing for the sake of describing like the phenomenological experience of approaching a limit that is presupposed in a sense. Like you already know what you're getting into a little bit. But what about in terms of if you were to take that assumption out? That's all. Like if you were to take that presupposed assumption out, that's my only thing. Like then the limit is in question, and it could be a possibly new limit, and that the phenomenological experience doesn't necessarily need to adhere to the limit A. It could be the limit B, so to speak.
Okay, just to I think this does lead into a whole other conversation, but I get you're saying, what if I take out the assumption of like what is a rock, what is climbing, and like then I wouldn't be rock climbing anymore. You know what I mean? Like you can say language is used by different people in different ways, and that's true, but like, you know, then we get into the whole sort of like deconstruction of language. I would say everybody in this conversation has enough of an idea about rock climbing to define what it is. So like, I don't know, I guess I don't fully understand your question, but maybe we should.
Well, this is a fascinating question because it to me gets into, I'm extremely interested on Hegel versus Heidegger, Heidegger versus Hegel. I reference Heidegger all the time. I reference Hegel all the time. And for Hegel, one of the very limits of thought itself that makes thought possible is this needing to use propositions, like assumptions, like sort of grasping. But once you know, here's the thing, thought, once it knows that it has to assume things to think, can then own those assumptions in a manner to try to sublimate that limitation into the very development of thought, where the absolute then becomes something that is partially constituted by your knowledge of the absolute, which then creates a true infinity because you're always reconstituting it, reconstituting it, reconstituting. And that's what's so weird in Hegel, where the limit of which is an awareness of the inability, say in this example, to escape propositions, assumptions, or whatever, then can be used by thought to create a true infinity, right? The question I have that I don't know that's fascinating to me is, where does Heidegger differ on that? Where does Heidegger agree on that? Because Heidegger, rightly so, is concerned about describing being in a manner that already assumes beings, a certain format of phenomenon to describe it, like describing it in terms of rock climbing, right? And be like, once you do that, you're no longer creating a clearing, you're constructing a philosophy on terms of rock climbing. Hegel would come along and say, you can't escape that. But knowing you can't escape that can then create a speculative reason that is always tarrying with that and upturning it and sublimating it. And that's where you could see the overlap in different things. So that to me is fascinating. We had one net conversation on the difference between I made up the term intersuppositional because I was trying to incorporate Buber, where the assumptions of your thought is between people as opposed to your own models, but there's a lot of different things that get into that. But this question on the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it to Javier and Dimitri, is there is, Mr. Luber, the point you're making on the problem of belief. The moment you say, I believe in God, there's a separation, I think is extremely valid. And actually, that's part of the problem, is you have to somehow think of belief in a manner that deconstructs the separation implied by that belief. That would be the Hegelian movement. What the heck does that look like? Tyler left, but we had a conversation the other day with a poet, and see this really great play of words. He said, you don't believe, you see, belief is to be a leaf. Belief is to be a leaf. And the play is you actually become the thing you believe. Like, and you see this in children. And this is why I think Nietzsche talking about children is such a big deal. Children don't believe they're leaves. They are leaves. They don't believe they're cats. They are cats. There is no separation between them thinking they're a cat and being a cat. My little Grace and Reed are always kittens. They just, boom, Grace says, Reed, we're going to be kittens. And they are kittens. There's no doubt. There's no separation. They just are. And it is very interesting. Yeah, I know you do. I see. Yeah, Javier, it's like, crap, my quota, my Buber quota. And that is what's interesting that Heidegger, I think, very wisely is pointing out, is the problem of philosophy as belief. Because in essence, a lot of philosophies are things people believe. Well, then there's a separation. right? There's a kind of division, whereas being a leaf or being the philosophy has a different kind of towardness that I think is Boobiarian, but this is a different conversation. I fear I will have to go, but hey, this is why we do it every week. Isn't that great? But this conversation, I am going to read Heidegger's book on Hegel. I'm extremely interested in his text on the phenomena. I got it from Better World Books. It's sitting over there. I'm very curious.
What is it called?
He wrote a book on, he wrote a series of books like on Leibniz, on Kant. He wrote one on Hegel, and it's on the phenomenology of spirit. I have not read it. I'm extremely curious on what he has to say. I have no idea. So I'll give that a read. But let me give it to Javier and Dimitri, and we'll meet up next week after the seminar on Nietzsche. We'll all have black eyes, we'll have bloody noses, we'll have broken arms, and we'll have another one of these after we survive the conference. But Mr. Javier Rivera, Dimitri, please.
Yeah, I mean, I only expect to do 15 minutes so I can give the other 15 minutes to, you know, so people can shit on me. But anyways.
What conferences are meant for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Anyways, yeah, so this topic is very difficult and it gets into a lot of weeds. But to, you know, this fluctuation between like being and non-being and talking about God, there's something that I've read in Buber that I've always thought was an interesting concept that I never wanted. I'm surprised he never decided to like expose further. But I think he kind of gets at it a little bit. It's the notion of voice, right? Which is very interesting because it's something that's consistent despite the fact whatever we talk about being or non-being. And then he says something in I and Thou about anytime a prophet reveals a message, the voice itself goes through modification. So in this way, we get like a very interesting relation about like how we can understand multiplicity through voice, and how even if you were to have a contact with God, the only thing that your contact would be doing would be modifying that voice because that is your sort of relation or the voice that you heard in your contact with this being. So it actually gets very interesting in that sense, but I've always thought the notion of voice seems to be something relatively consistent, whereas the tension is always sort of like turning yourself towards that voice rather than, you know, being stuck into like some universal or particular. The voice sort of like is something that always has like rhetorical context, you could say. But speaking of the children example, which I love that Daniel brought up, Buber actually argues this too, where he's talking about like, you know, the child doesn't like distinguish himself immediately. Like the reason why the child is dangerous is because he doesn't see a boundary. That's the problem, is that he's so involved in the world that he doesn't have enough self-consciousness to be like, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't stick my hand in there, right? Everything is like a playful immersion. It's everything is like almost like an extension of himself. And so us as adults, we have to be like, hey, you can't do that because you're really going to hurt yourself. You know, we've already made those boundaries. But the child is dangerous because he's in such a relation to the world that there is no boundaries. There's almost like no limits. Which, you know, reminds me of the Nietzschean kind of thing, you know, danger, risk. It's like he's trying to reclaim some type of innocence again. But, you know, and this is why I kind of like Nietzsche for this. But yeah, again, the relationality is what Buber's always been stuck on, this notion of relation. And I think this is why I've been advocate on, you know, finding the tension wherever that is, because that seems to be a good indicator about what we should do and what we should not do. It's the particular for everybody. Language and everything else gets very complicated. We want to deconstruct language. But I mean, you know, if I were to put my attention relativity to the test, I would say this. If you're against language deconstruction, you should do it because that's where the tension is. And if you've never done language deconstruction and you don't want to do it, then you should do it because that's where your tension is, you know. And that's why I'm always kind of advocating, where it's like, if I've never thought about being an atheist before and I'm like just have such a distaste for the idea, then I should go into that tension, right? I should entertain like a sort of radical doubt where I'm like, oh my God, maybe there is no God. You know, it's just sort of like do like some type of method acting where I'm like a complete atheist, you know, and try to put myself in what that feels. So yeah, I think there's a lot there to use, but yeah.
Javier is going to start like a acting school where you go and do method acting for like the opposite religion that you're in. That's going to be like a thing. It's going to get on like the Entrepreneur, what's that magazine, Forbes or whatever? No, Inc. Yeah, it's going to be there. It's going to be do really, really well. It is interesting. And then I'll pass it to Dimitri. I like to talk about transitional metaphors, where you use a metaphor to the limit of describing something that it breaks, and you move to another metaphor and you use, which I think the rule in English class where you don't use mixed metaphors actually gets us in the habit of not doing. We use a single metaphor to describe, say, the philosophical journey, and then we stick to that forever, but then it shapes our thinking, just like I.A. Richards warned with education or different things. And it's like, you can't escape using language, but you can relate. Yeah, metaphor dancing, that's nice. But you can relate to a language that holds it with an open hand, you know, Michelle with the bird, as opposed to drop, no language at all, or clutch. This is the only language, because when you clutch a language, that language ends up shaping your thinking in ways you don't even realize. So then you have to learn how to move between languages and also move between language in that space. And those are all those kind of mental tools that one has to practice to really get into the business of thinking, dare I say. But with that, let me give it to Dimitri.
Yeah, I think definitely growing up with multiple languages, philosophy is so similar to learning languages, because you get all kinds of cultural baggage with it, and there's slight differences which you can't. It's like that. I think that's kind of the paradoxical thing about language, is that there's a kind of objet a, you know, a je ne sais quoi. Like you can't really, I can't tell you how it's different to read Nietzsche in German or Dutch. You know, I can like go around it and intimate it to you in certain ways, but I can't just like pin it down in English. So there's always something lost in translation, but what kind of is lost is kind of elusive. I think it's objet a, so even in that sense, it's not even universalizable. You know, not to say like, oh, you have to learn German to understand Nietzsche. No, I think like actually to be a good dialectical thinker means that no, you don't have to necessarily learn other languages, because if it's universal, then it can be translated. That's interesting to think about for the future, for sure. But I will just end with this one thing, and that is that if we follow this idea of Grenzen and Schrenken, of limit and limitation, that means that the moment you know it's a limit, you have overcome it. You're already over it, because you know both sides of the very thing that's in between the things. So I would like to end with that thought, and yeah, I had a great time. Thank you.
That's beautiful, Dimitri. And I should note, what's so interesting in Hegel is that precisely the limit that Kant points out means you're limited from experiencing that limit. But then you have, you can't experience the noumenon, which is precisely the indication that there's a limit. But if you know that limit, the very fact that you're limited from experiencing the noumenon, you decide, that kind of gets into the absolute choice, what that means, and if you have power for it, or if it limits you. And so there's that interesting kind of play. And then the question becomes, what is the best way of thinking to, quote unquote, tarry with that? And it seems to have something to do with this ability to say dance between a metaphor of rock climbing, dance, and then you're talking about jazz and improvisation, all of which is in service to try to overcome our own tendency to osmosify into a single language or a single metaphoric structure or a single set of propositions, be able to move between those. And it would seem, if we're thinking Nietzsche, and I like what Javier was saying on the dancing metaphor, then there's a perpetual dancing where you're always overcoming your thought's tendency to be the last thought, per se. We have to overcome being the last man. There's something about thinking that wants to be the last thought. Like, final thought, I understand everything and I'm done, right? You know, you have to overthought, almost overthinking, but not in a kind of like hyper, I can't stop thinking, but overcoming the tendency of thought to be the last thought into overcoming. That seems to have something to do with thinking about it in terms of rock climbing, then thinking about on different languages, and to keep moving and to keep moving and to keep dancing, to keep down. I'm talking about Dance Dance Revolution, Javier. You never played it. I was pretty good at it. Okay. I really like Dance Dance Revolution. Okay. In the comments there. So that seems to have a lot to do with what they're getting at. And what's interesting is that seems to be a kind of practice that is doing something practically that ends up creating a kind of space that Heidegger seems to have been interested in. And so that's where I see overlay. But then the question is, what is the mechanism of creating those quote unquote clearings, right? Is it this dancing between metaphors? What are the practices that give rise to those different things? But that's a very big question. I appreciate all of you fine people. Thank you for being here. It is always a delight. You're beautiful souls. And with that, I will run. So thank you so much for being here today. I've really enjoyed it. We had many people come through the diner. That was a lot of fun. So I look forward to seeing you at the Nietzsche conference, everyone. Well, actually, you'll see Haven. So Haven, look forward to seeing you at the Nietzsche conference. He'll be reading off a paper. And thank you so much, everyone. And y'all have a great day.